how do we recognize what we see? A useful distinction is the difference between sensation and perception. Sensation refers to the initial registering of information into your senses without realizing what that information is. In contrast, perception refers to knowing what you are sensing, the interpretation of the input. Some common terms in this area are low-level visual analysis versus high-level visual analysis. Low-level visual analysis means the detecting of basic shape, size, and color, whereas high-level visual analysis refers to making connection with memory so that you can identify what you're looking at. The primary visual cortex is involved in the processing of low-level aspects of vision, including some color perception. In contrast, the vision association context area, shown here in the brighter red, is involved in connecting low-level visual analysis to higher levels of knowledge, integrating the information with other information from the scene, as well as what we know about the world. In contrast, the visual association area is involved in connecting that low-level visual analysis to higher levels of knowledge, integrating information with other information in the scene, as well as what we know about the world. Do you remember this dress? It went viral because some people saw the dress when it was displayed as gold and white, while other people saw it as blue and black, the very same dress. The dress was actually, in reality, blue and black. So why did some people see it as gold and white? The explanation was that our brains are actually making adjustments in what we see all the time, adjusting how we interpret the colors in our environment. So if you viewed the initial dress in a shadowy environment, then there was an overrepresentation of blue light, and the brain compensated for that, taking out excess blue light, but maybe too much, so some people ended up seeing the dress as white and gold. If you viewed the dress in natural light, there was maybe an overrepresentation of some blue light, and also you ended up seeing the dress as white and gold because your brain adjusted by removing some of that blue light. If you viewed the dress in incandescent light, such as around light bulbs and lamps, then there would be an overrepresentation of yellow light, and then you probably saw the blue and black dress because the brain adjusted by removing some of the yellow light. Our brains are also making adjustments in terms of interpreting the size of objects. Sometimes you get cool visual illusions because of how the brain makes this adjustment. An example would be the moon illusion. Sometimes the moon appears larger sometimes than others. So for example, on the horizon, sometimes the moon will appear very large. But when you look way up in the sky on another night, the moon looks quite small. But the moon hasn't changed sizes. Our brains are making adjustments that lead to the moon being perceived as these different sizes. So what do we know about how we recognize objects and keep track of them in space? We know that there are two pathways in recognizing objects in the visual cortex. One of the pathways, the ventral pathway, is involved in recognizing objects and faces, but the dorsal pathway is involved in motion perception and also in how we approach objects to handle them. Damage to the ventral pathway may leave you with visual agnosia, which comes from the word without knowing. A for without and nausea for knowing. A person can see fine, but they're unable to understand what the particular object is that they're seeing. In visual agnosia, people typically will have damage to the ventral area of the visual pathway, but not the dorsal one. So interestingly, they're still able to reach for an object in the appropriate way. So in the diagram you see reaching for a pencil versus reaching for a cup with a handle, despite the fact that they are not able to name what the object is or tell you anything about it. So here's a diagram showing that you might have damage to the ventral area and be left with visual agnosia, but your dorsal pathway is still intact, meaning that you can reach for objects in the particular way that's best for them to be reached for. The inability to recognize faces can be viewed as also an inability to recognize a type of object. So, the area in the brain that is specialized in recognizing faces is very localized in the right hemisphere, and it's called the fusiform face area that you see in the diagram. Some people may have prosopagnosia because they have damage to this area due to a brain injury, but there are other people with no known brain damage who have this kind of problem, also called face blindness, from birth. In the last few decades, people have become much more aware of face blindness, and some relatively famous people have come out and said, yes, I have this, including Brad Pitt, Oliver Sacks, Jane Goodall, and Steve Wozniak. New estimates suggest that as many as 2% of the population may have face blindness. That would be 1 in 50 people. Damage to the dorsal area, in particular the MTV5 region, could leave you with the inability to perceive the motion of objects, which has also been called a kinetopsia. You understand what the object is, and you can see it in space, but you can't see it when it's moving. Instead, you see it as a series of still photo shots. It's very disconcerting to those who have it. Biological motion refers to the patterns of movement that we can perceive in our minds as belonging to living things, such as humans or animals moving around in space. Researchers have found that the area of the brain that's responsible for perceiving biological motion is the superior temporal sulcus, or STS. That's all for now.